Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we'll be having another top 10 list for you all. Today I'll be covering my top 10 most underrated board games. Last time I covered my top 10 most overrated board games, and this time I'll be doing quite the opposite, top 10 most underappreciated games as far as I'm concerned. Of course, these are all games that I've played. These also happen to be all games that I own. Now, the criteria that I used was basically, I didn't even consider the game if it was within the top 1,000 on boardgamegeek.com. And I ranked it based on the discrepancy of how much I like it. And I like all these games a lot. And the discrepancy between my appreciation for it and the average boardgamegeek.com user. So as I rank it from 10 to 1, it's going to go in ascending order according to its rankings in boardgamegeek.com. So my number 10 will be the highest ranked game on boardgamegeek.com, and my number 1 will be the lowest ranked game. And the reason why I did this is because quite often when you see these underrated games, really what you see is people giving their games that are still very, very popular and liked and appreciated and recognized among the Board Game Geek community. However, they're not as highly ranked as they would like them to be. And really what that gives you an insight is an insight into that reviewer's taste and preference for board games, not necessarily an idea about some obscure, underappreciated hidden gems that are out there in the industry. And that's exactly what I want to present with this list. With no further ado, we'll go on to my number 10. And this game is the highest ranked out of all of these. It's ranked 1017, so it just barely missed. As of this recording, just barely missed the top 1,000. I'm sure a couple months ago, maybe a few years ago, it was in the top 1,000, but right now it's not. And that is Mercator, designed by Uwe Rosenberg and published by Lookout Games. This is a phenomenal pick up and delivery, resource conversion, contract fulfillment game. Not only are you managing all the different resources that this game has, and it has a tons of resources, but you're also managing the money, right? Your gold coins, and you're also managing the time. You have these little tokens right here which represent time, and traveling to certain parts of the world, or in this case Europe, costs not only effort and resources, but it costs money, and you need to use that for that. So players have this collective piece, the Mercator piece, that they're moving across the board. And the board is an abstracted representation of Europe during Renaissance times and a little bit of the New World, right? The New World is represented by one space. The thing is, instead of making, for graphic design purposes, instead of making the map actually resemble Europe, they just created this very abstracted, albeit functional board with square spaces representing the different countries or locations in Europe. Same thing with the resources. Instead of your typical veggie meeple type of thing that Uwe is known for, you have these cubes, and these cubes, each cube represents 2 different resources. So based on where you keep them on your individual player board determines what resource they are. So again, they went more for gameplay functionality than they did for aesthetic appeal, and I think that has cost them. Not all of Uwe Rosenberg's games are lookers per se, but this is definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, his worst looking game. But in my opinion, it's actually one of his best games as far as gameplay is concerned. I love the contract fulfillment and how it works. I love the fact that you could piggyback on another player's turn, especially if you have those time resources that you can expend. I love the fact that you're manipulating all these different resources and you're doing some pickup and delivery and gathering goods from one location and finding a way to get it to another location in order to fulfill a contract. Awesome, wonderful, meaty game. Plays very well solo. Plays great multiplayer. My number 10 most underrated game of all time, Mercator. Now we move on to my number 9. And my number 9 most underrated game of all time is none other than Tiny Epic Western. And Tiny Epic Western is designed by Scott Almes and published by Gameland Games. This is one of the many games within the Tiny Epic series. This is ranked on BGG as of this recording, 1,385. So it's still in the top 1,500, But I believe it's not even the top 5 Tiny Epic games. And I think this game is really cool and really neat. Now, obviously, I have an affinity for the Wild West theme. I have an affinity for that idea of city building, building different buildings that create a city. I like the incorporation of poker-like mechanisms in a board game. And this actually has straight up poker, 3-card poker to be exact. Really well implemented. I love worker placement. This has worker placement. I don't love, but I don't mind the idea of dueling for worker placement spots, which is quite, popular and similar to other Wild West themed worker placement games. I love the idea of stock market, right? And majority shares. And that's what you have in this game, because you have 3 different industries, and players who, as they're buying their buildings, are vying for, majorities in certain industries, and in particular, they're trying to manipulate certain industries to increase those industries' values so that their buildings and their shares increase in value as well. Love that. That is absolutely neat. Again, resource management, resource conversion. You got 3 different resources. You got law, you got power, and you got gold. And you're trying to manipulate and manage all those resources as well as possible. Also, this game has a highly functional solo mode with a fully functional AI or automa player. Not every solo game has that. Some solos only have that beat your score or reach a certain threshold thing. Not in this game. You have an opponent that you could modify their difficulty levels in order to get the challenge that you need. My number 9 most underrated board game of all time, Tiny Epic Western. Now we move on to my number 7 most underrated game, and that is none other than Tower of Babel, designed by Reiner Knizia and published by Rio Grande Games. This is an area majority game designed by Reiner Knizia in the mid-2000s, where players are collaboratively working. It's almost like a semi-co-op, because you're making trades with the active player, but the active player can only accept one of the other opponent's trade offers to help them build these wonders of the world. Because basically, this is a building of the 7 wonders plus Tower of Babel as the 8th wonder. And as you help the opponent, not only does the opponent get to collect certain resource tokens, which helps us towards a set collection, which gives them points at the end of the game, but also they get to place their workers on that wonders location, and the player who helped the active player gets to place some workers there too, equal to the amount of cards they were willing to give up. So that's cool, because then you collaborate, but it's because you have something to gain. And then you have all these 8 different scoring areas, which are going to score throughout the game. You're going to score for majority, for secondary, and also for just having any presence on that location. You'll get a little consolation prize, a few victory points. However, with every subsequent area that gets scored, the scoring increases. You have this scoring track that goes down, and with each level, the bonuses that you get for having the majority, the secondary, increase. Your little consolation prize always stays the same. It's always 3 points. But first and secondary will always increase with each subsequent round. So sometimes you might not want to score too early, because in a future round, you'll be able to milk it and capitalize and score more points. Now, this is another game that suffers terribly from its poor graphic design and component quality. Look at this board. I think even by 2005 standards, when this game was first published, this is subpar. It is so plain. Everything blends in with one another. Nothing stands out. It looks very, very much abstracted, which, to be truth be told, all area majority games, or most of them, really are very abstracted when you really think about it. However, the board and the graphic design does not help a player immerse himself in the situation. But the mechanisms of this game, first of all, big fan of area majority. But second of all, again, that trading mechanism where players can offer, may not offer, sometimes bluff, and then the opponent chooses which offer they want to accept. Really, really neat. I adore this game, but on BGG, it is ranked as low as 1,688. My number 8 most underrated board game of all time, Tower of Babel. Now we move on to my number 7, and it is King Domino, designed by Bruno Cathala and Ludovic Mablanc, and published by Blue Orange Games. And this game currently, as of this recording, on boardgamegeek.com, ranks as low as 2,252. It is not even in the top 2,000, although it is the younger sibling of one of the most popular games on boardgamegeek.com, King Domino. This game is so much better than King Domino. And don't get me wrong, I like King Domino. It's cool, it's neat, it's fun. But this game is even better. First of all, it's a roll and write, and we know that there's a craze for roll and writes nowadays. Granted, this is a 2-player only roll and write. You can't play it solo unless you use some sort of variant. You can't play it multiplayer. It's very specific in that sense. But so are lots of games that are very highly ranked on boardgamegeek.com. But this one is really cool. You roll the dice, and then you draft the dice, and the 2 dice that you draft, each player is going to draft 2 dice. They form your virtual tile where you place it, and you just scribble in certain shield symbols to indicate the ones that you rolled on the dice. And again, you score the same way as in regular King Domino. You match the amount of crosses with the amount of terrain types that are, adjacent to one another. You multiply that, you add all the scores. But also, after you've rolled or selected a certain amount of dice of a single type, you unlock special abilities, special one-time abilities, that really can help you make a comeback, solidify a lead. Really cool. Just the spatial orientation, the spatial intelligence that you must exercise in order to play this game. Fun and neat. It takes the best parts of King Domino Duel and adds a little bit more of thought and meatiness to the game. My number 7 most underrated board game of all time, King Domino Duel. Now we move on to my number 6 most underrated game, and that is Carson City, the card game. And again, this is a younger sibling to a bigger game, which is known as simply Carson City, the board game, and which is a worker placement game. This is a card game where players are manipulating. They have their imaginary 8x8 grid, which they are using and building their part of Carson City by drafting these different squared cards. And each of these cards have 4 spaces or 4 quadrants that have different terrain features and or buildings. You might have blank spaces or mountains. You might have mines, or you might have city hall buildings or hotels or banks or even prisons. And you're drafting these buildings, and these different buildings give you different benefits, primarily points that score you in different ways depending on what other buildings are in your city, what buildings are adjacent, and so on and so forth. And before each round, you have a really neat auction for turn order where players are playing one of their 9 cards in their own particular suit, range from number 1 through 9, in order to determine the player order. And there's always a tiebreaker based on the back of the top card on the character deck. And this tells you which suit has the tiebreaker for that given round. So even so, you know your probabilities of winning an auction for that given round. And then players in turn order continue to choose their cards, placing them then down in the tableau, again respecting the imaginary 8x8 grid. What's cool about this game, besides the plethora of different ways of scoring, is that it has a wonderful solo mode with 3 AI players that you have to play, because no matter what the player count is, you always have to have 4 players. No matter how many human players, you need to have 4. That is so cool. Even if you play 2 to 3, you still have 1 or 2 automa players that you have to factor in. And of course, you could play this with 5 players, 6 players, and so on and so forth. Really fun, cool, Wild West themed game with some really neat scoring mechanisms and an amazing auction for turn order. My number 6 most underrated board game of all time, Carson City, the board game. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. And my number 5 most underrated game of all time, sorry for the noise, is Deadwood, which is another Wild West themed game. That's actually my 3rd Wild West themed game in this top 10, which shows that I have a bias, I'll admit. But this game is another worker placement game, just like Tiny Epic Western. And this game also has dueling for specific worker placement spots. And I love this game because you got straight up city building, right? The city of Deadwood starts with like 5 buildings, and as the game progresses, you're adding more buildings to the city of Deadwood that add different spots that you can go to with your workers that give you different abilities, but also it gives you the sense of growth, right? Even though this is not a cooperative game, to some extent, players are working together towards building the city of Deadwood. But you're also trying to be, the cowboy or the gunman or the outlaw or what have you, with the most money at the end of the game. And all these different buildings get you money in different ways. Also, this game has 3 different end game triggers, which I really, really like. I like the idea that a game does not necessarily end the same way each and every single time. So you either once one player loses all their cowboys, all their workers, because that can happen, they could all die. Workers who lose a duel in this game don't just go back to your supply. They actually go to Foothill, or Boot Hill, I should say, and they are buried there. And going forward, at that point, once you have no more workers left at your disposal, that triggers the end of the game. Even other players do. Also, you have wanted posters that players acquire every time they trigger a duel. Well, once those wanted posters run out, the game is also over. And finally, you have the train station. You're building the railroad track throughout the game, and finally you build the train station. And when you build the train station, that also triggers the end of the game. Whoever has the most money wins. Those wanted posters, yes, you ended up winning lots of duels in the meantime, but any wanted posters that you were not able to get rid of by going to the church or some other relevant building, all of those are going to count towards negative points for you at the end of the game. So that's something to factor in. Again, this game could benefit from better graphic design. I like the, old school look of the dice. It gives you an old school Western flavor. I don't mind the way they represented the money. The tiles are okay, but I think the worker placement, the worker pieces, which are tiles, maybe it would have been cool to have some nice cowboy shaped meeples. The game board could have had a better aesthetic to it, a better graphic design. But either way, the gameplay is highly functional. I didn't mention. First of all, Carson City, I forgot to mention, ranked as low as 2,563. Carson City, the card game. And Deadwood here ranks as low as 2,395. Can you believe it? Okay, so there is that. My number 5 most underrated board game of all time, Deadwood. And now we move on to my number 4, which is the game that you heard, which is Knights of Charlemagne, designed by Reiner Knizia, and I don't remember who's the original publisher. I've actually gotten rid of the box. I only keep the rule book here and the components in a separate board game box. And the components only consist of these tiles. You have these different colored tiles that represent 5 points. And then you have some of these numbered tiles that range from 1 through 5, and they score you the respective or corresponding amount of points. And basically you have these colored cards in 5 different colors ranging 1 through 5. There's 2 of each number. And this is basically Reiner Knizia's first game in the evolution of what eventually would become games like Schaden, Battle Line, Lost Cities. This is where it all got started, right? He has these different cards, and you're assigning these cards to the different sections. And in order to, place a card, it either has to match the number of the tile from 1 through 5 for some tiles, or it has to match the color of the tile for the different colored tiles. And at the end of each round, you score points for having the majority of cards underneath the corresponding tiles. So there is some imperfect information because you do discard a certain amount of cards according to the number of players, and you're trying to place things down and strategically, hope for the best, but also count the costs and the probabilities of how likely it is for you to get certain cards, and also know which areas are the most valuable to invest towards. Really cool, really fun. It's not amazing. It's not going to blow your socks off, but this game is ranked as low as 3,804. And there's so many games of the same, level, the same weight, that are not as fun or as interesting to me, at least, that rank higher than 3,804. So that's why this is my number 4 most underrated board game of all time, Knights of Charlemagne. And now we move on to my number 3. And my number 3 most underrated game of all time is Scarab Lords, also designed by Reiner Knizia. This also has a sister game called Minotaur Lord, which ranked even lower than this, but I'm counting this one as the standee for this spot. This game ranked here 3,827. And this game is basically Reiner Knizia's answer to games like Magic the Gathering. And again, it's a further development of these type of games that he started working on, like Knights of Charlemagne and Schaden / Battle Line. So basically, players are playing down these cards, and these cards are highly thematic, especially for Reiner Knizia's standards. They have some flavor text, Some of them have some special abilities, kind of corresponding with the type of card that they are. And they have numbers, kind of like Magic the Gathering, right? And basically, you're trying to have the majority. The board consists of this little row, which shows 6 different sections and 2 halves. So you have 1 half here and 1 half here. And the goal of the game is to have the highest valued sum of numbers of cards underneath these sections. And in particular, you want to be in control of 2 sections on one side and 2 sections on the other side. And if you control 2 sections on either side, on both sides, by the beginning of your turn, you win the game. Not at the end of your turn. You need to survive and hold on till the next turn in order to win the game. And that little tug of war and going back and forth, really, really cool. Also, the game, the cards have certain numbers here ranging from 0, 1, and 2. And basically your turns consist of these phases. You have a 0 phase, a 1 phase, and a 2 phase. And for each phase, you could play down 1 card of the corresponding phase number. However, sometimes you might have 2 really, really good cards that you want to play on the same turn, but they both have the same phase number there. So you can't play them the same turn. So that's rough. However, you also have some delimitations to where you can place these cards, because these cards on the left column will indicate that they could only be placed in some of these sections. You have a blue, a red, and a green section. There are a few cards that could be played on any section of your choice, but some of them can only be played 1 or in 1 of 2. So that, again, gives you some challenges. Also, in this game, once a player runs out of their deck, that's one of the ways that they lose this game. Other than the area control going on, you can lose this game by running out of your deck. So sometimes simple little decisions like the drawing of more cards, you might want to think twice before you do that, because again, as you deplete that deck of yours and progress throughout the game, you're giving yourself a shorter time frame in which to take control of those 4 areas. So that is something to think about from turn to turn as you make your decisions. That's why this is my number 3 most underrated board game of all time, Scarab Lords. And now we move on to my number 2. And my number 2 is Sola Fide, designed by Jason Matthews and Christian Leonard. And these designers, especially Jason Matthews, have worked on lots of games that are well received and highly ranked on boardgamegeek.com. This does not happen to be one of them. This game here is ranked number 4070. And I think it's a great game. I think the theme is refreshing. I understand that some people, this might not be their cup of tea. This revolves the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. But at the same time, it's very abstracted, and you don't have this real strong religious connotation in the gameplay. Also, this game is a re-implementation of an older game known as Campaign Manager 2008. So if you do not like the content matter, you could try to snatch a copy of that older game if you find a used copy for a good price. But either way, this game is cool because you're doing some area majority in the different parts of Europe as the Protestants and the Catholics are vying for influence over the people. And you have the nobles and you have the peasants, and you're trying to control or gain the favor of both of those communities, the nobles and the peasants. Both of their opinions matter, right? And in some areas, the nobles' opinion matters a little bit more, and in other areas, the peasants and their opinions matter a little bit more. And also, you're doing cards, and your cards give you your actions. Your cards allow you to move the cubes that determine how much influence you have and whether or not you've won over a certain location. Your cards determine if you do things like draw more cards. It determines whether or not you do things that hurt your opponents and regress them in certain areas. And at the beginning of each game, you do a little bit of deck construction. You do a little draft within your own player deck, this asymmetric decks, the Roman side and the Roman Catholic Church side and the Protestant side, each have decks that do slightly different things. So you do a little bit of deck construction in the game. And that part is fun too. I like the area majority. I like the cards. I like the intrigue. It's a nice political type game, very similar to some other games designed by Jason Matthews. And again, just gives you a nice little feel. I think this game is underrated at 4070. My number 2 most underrated board game of all time, Sola Fide. And now we move on to my number 1. And my number 1 is a game that people have already commented on previous videos saying, really? You like this game? What is this game? My number one most underrated game is Res Publica, designed by Reiner Knizia and published by Queen's Games. This game is so much fun, and it is ranked as low on boardgamegeek.com as 5,383. This game has some nice, first of all, it has amazing trading. If you like trading games, you should consider this game. You're trying to get sets, some set collection also, you're trying to get sets of these different people group cards. And every time you get a set of 5, you can turn them in for a victory point card. There's victory point cards. It's a little bit like Dominion in that sense. And you have settlements that give you 3 points every time you get those victory point cards. And you have cities that give you a descending number of points. So the first person to get a city is going to get 9 points. But the second and third person to get a city are only going to get 8 points. And then the third and fourth are going to get 7 points. And again, it keeps on going down as the game progresses. But those city cards will always be more valuable than the settlement cards. So if you turn in 5 people group cards, you get a settlement. If you turn in 5 technology cards, you get a city. But throughout the game, besides drafting the top card of these respective piles, the draw decks, you can also make trade offers to your opponents. And basically, the neat part of this game is that you only make 1/2 of the trade offer. In other words, you either make the offer, what you're willing to give up, or the expectation, what you want in return. You cannot do both. You cannot say, I want 2 Vikings for 3 Anglo-Saxons. You got to say something like, I'm willing to give an Anglo-Saxon. And in clockwise order, all your opponents make a counter offer, the other side of the trade to complete it. And you decide if you want to accept one of their offers or not. And that part is so cool because you really got to pay attention to what your opponents are doing, what they do not have, what they do not want. So in future turns, you can make more efficient trades, right? Really fun, cool. It's a filler of a game. You could play this game in about 30 minutes. The box says 30 to 45. Hardly ever does it push the 45-minute threshold. It's a quick game. Fun, set collection, cards for points, and some neat trading. My number one most underrated board game of all time, Res Publica. And that's it, folks. That's all for today. Please comment down below. What do you think is the most underrated or the most underrated board games according to Board Game Geek standards, according to the community and what people are talking about or are not talking about? Which of my games do you think deserve to be underrated? All right, everybody. I'm interested in reading what you have to say in the comments down below. This is Harry from When Harry Met Board Games saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.